Good afternoon, everyone. Let's hope you can stay with us in this conversation. We'll try to keep it interesting and digestible, not that you need much more. Welcome to the Rising Bharat Summit, Professor Babones. You're here at the peak of the world's, not just India's, the world's biggest and most inclusive festival, a festival of democracy. The greatest edification of the power of the vote anywhere in the world. And many people have a perspective on India's democracy under Prime Minister Modi's watch. How would you describe India's democracy today?
India has a democracy, a liberal democracy, a robust liberal democracy on the Western model. India's critics love to say that India is not a liberal democracy. Internally, many people in India resent when you say it's on the Western model. But the fact is, India's democratic institutions are modeled after institutions in North America, Western Europe, and Australasia, and India's institutions would not be out of place in any of those regions of the world. India is, in effect, the world's only relatively poor, post-colonial, highly traditional country that nonetheless has cracked the code about how to run a liberal democracy.
Very interesting. I want to ask you if you think, and you're obviously someone who hails from the United States, which is often called the mother of democracy, though I
thought India was the mother of democracy.
As I said, well, anyhow. How do you assess India's democracy? Is it free? Is it fair? Is it inclusive? We've just had a massive debate break out over the CAA law. Many people think that it's sort of prejudiced against a particular community, and therefore India's democracy is no longer inclusive, and it's certainly not headed that way. How do you respond to that?
The Citizenship Amendment Act is good policy, but bad politics. It's good policy, and it's only possible in India because India is an inclusive society, an inclusive democracy. If you look at the places, the countries that British India spawned, look at the Maldives, an exclusively Muslim society. Look at Pakistan, an exclusively Muslim society. Sri Lanka, an exclusively Buddhist society. Myanmar, an exclusively Buddhist society. Out of all the places governed by the British in South Asia, only India emerged as an inclusive society. And I think that's probably because India is a fundamentally Hindu society. Note, I don't say it's a secular society, it's a secular state. But India's Hindu society was able to support a secular state in a way that those Muslim and Buddhist societies were not able. All of those countries started out as secular states, but all of them have become thoroughly exclusive and thoroughly religious in their state institutions. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Act is there because people from all around the region, not only the three countries in the Act, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, people from all around the region want to seek refuge in India because of India's traditions of liberty that are not present in their own countries. That says a lot about the character of India, but it also says a lot about the character of the neighbors. The only sad thing is that the CAA, and I'm just going to be very frank here, has been weaponized for political gain. It's clearly been reauthorized here during an election season. It's being used to gain votes, and it's being used to divide people. It's a good law being used for bad purposes.
Well, I mean, that's obviously an interesting point of view because many people would say that the people who are critical of the CAA were the greatest espousers of a law of that nature. But, you know, that's left for another day.
It's a good law. There's not a problem with the law. There's a problem with seeking political advantage out of the plight of refugees.
When is a good time to save refugees who are being persecuted?
Yeah, 10 years ago. It's a good time.
Okay. Let's move the needle a little forward. Gothenburg's based V-Dems 224 report labels on multiple metrics India as, quote, one of the worst autocratizers, unquote. In fact, it pegs India to a level last seen in 1975, can you believe it, when Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency. How are we Dem and your assessment so widely different? Aren't they interviewing enough Hindus?
Look, the Varieties of Democracy Institute is a highly reputable European research institution based at Gothenburg University in Sweden. They have, however, set up a highly flawed statistical methodology for measuring democracy. They have 5 chief indicators. 2 of them is does a country have elections, and is everybody allowed to vote, are evaluated on a purely pro forma basis, meaning that, for example, Vietnam gets a perfect score for its elections, despite the fact it only has 1 political party that's allowed. Now, VDEM has recently rated India number 110 in the world, which I think is a travesty, but it's not VDEM doing the rating. Most of the differentiation in VDEM is based on their survey results. They survey mostly political scientists, mostly in the country being studied. So primarily Indian political scientists being asked to evaluate India on a series of subjective indicators. The places where India now rates worse than during the emergency include the independence of Electoral Commission, include freedom of speech and association, and include academic freedom. Now, I just read an article in the New York Times. I do a lot of historical research. I just read an article in the New York Times from 1975, which said that students at Delhi University were applauding the emergency because now school could return to normal. Which is to say, those people who embraced the Indira Gandhi regime, they're today, or their children today, are now evaluating the emergency as having been a good time for academic freedom. Why? Because all those right-wing activists were arrested. And at a time when thousands of students were arrested during the emergency, VDEM rates India better for academic freedom than it does today.
There's another agency that says that press freedoms in India are at a level less than in Afghanistan.
You should have said Pakistan. Yeah.
Okay. Is the methodology to blame, or is it bias, as some claim?
Look, worse than Venezuela, worse than the Palestinian territories, 20th worst in the world. Pretty much only China and Saudi Arabia and Iran get worse position than India. Maybe the most egregious, Hong Kong is placed 20 ranks above India for press freedom. Hong Kong, where, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has outlawed all opposition press. Again, we have to ask, who's doing the rating? The Reporters Sans Frontières, the organization that produces the Press Freedom Index, does not directly evaluate countries. They send a survey out to journalists. Rahul, were you surveyed in this survey?
No, I just want to ask anyone. Was anyone here surveyed in that survey?
Was any mainstream Indian journalist surveyed by Reporters Sans Frontières? I doubt it. Now, I don't know. Of course, they won't divulge who their survey takers are, and for good reason. They don't want them to face violence or face pressure. But we'd like to know, is Reporters Sans Frontières surveying journalists at major metropolitan newspapers and television channels, or are they surveying journalists at radical, critical websites? I strongly suspect the latter. Of course, we'll never know, but that's how we get India rated so low for press freedom. It's not because actual reporters like you are rating press freedom low. It's almost certainly because of the pool of people who form the Reporters Sans Frontières pool of survey takers.
So there's confirmation bias. That's what you're suggesting. When it comes, I mean, are these people just wanting to project that, or why aren't they going further afield?
No, look, they represent the interests of their members. Are you a member of Reporters Sans Frontières?
No.
Well, if you joined, if all the other journalists in the room joined, you could then ask to participate in this survey. But in fact, Reporters Sans Frontières has a constituency mostly among radical Marxist journalists, and they're the people who answer the survey. And I have to stress, it's India's journalists who are rating India low. It's not the French office, head office, that's rating India low.
But can you actually blame these surveys when so many of our politicians go abroad and they sit in some very, very storied institutions, and they denote India as an electoral autocracy also.
There is a positive feedback loop here. They're saying India is an autocracy, thus India gets reported to be an autocracy, thus people get the impression India is an autocracy, thus they can point to the New York Times or the Washington Post and say India is an electoral autocracy. Look, in America we have the same problem. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have criticized U.S. elections as being meaningless, fraudulent. Joe Biden actually said no better than those of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. We don't take that seriously. Why not? Because all of you have been to Disney World. All of you read the U.S. news. You're familiar with the main actors. When Donald Trump says something, you don't take it that seriously. When Joe Biden says something, you don't take it that seriously. But when an American hears a major Indian politician say that, well, democracy's gone in India, well, that American's familiar with many developing countries where democracy has been destroyed, where opposition leaders have come to America to ask for help, and we simply accept that the narrative is true because we know so little about India.
Let me ask you, in the past, Professor Babones, you've said that India's intellectual class is anti-India. What did you mean by this?
And I said anti-India as a class.
As a class.
Not as individuals. What I mean by that is nothing remarkable. Australia's intellectual class is anti-Australia as a class. There's constant talk in Australia about intellectuals being anti-Australian. America's intellectual class is constantly critical of the United States and its institutions. There's nothing surprising about that. I said that as an explanation because I wanted Indians to understand that all of the negative reporting about Indian democracy does not originate with Western experts who are independently coming to India to evaluate your country. It originates with Indian intellectuals who are writing for Western outlets, Indian intellectuals who are coming to speak at Western academic conferences, Indian origin intellectuals who are writing in Western academic journals and telling us that India is no longer a democracy. And we believe them because we don't know India.
Well, many people say that some of these intellectuals, or call them what you think, have hypothecated themselves to foreign influence, and the name of George Soros, and beyond him some Western intellectuals and governments are bandied about. Is this hyperbole, or are there malevolent forces that are promoting these individuals to say all these nasty things and color Bharat's rise?
Look, there are malevolent forces, but there are malevolent forces against every country. It's nothing unique to India. George Soros is a favorite bugbear of people around the world, and I'll tell you, Dr. Jaishankar loves nothing better than being criticized by George Soros, because then he can get on television and defend India against these evil Western manipulators. The fact is, George Soros doesn't tell academics what to think. Neither do the other influential billionaire funders. In fact, most of the funding of the research that churns out anti-India research papers comes from Indians themselves. That is, Indian billionaires who fund research centers at Harvard and at Stanford, who churn out research that tell us that India is no longer a democracy. Yes, the Soroses and the Templetons have something to do with this, but I'm sorry to keep repeating this message. Primarily, it originates right here in India.
Well, so let's explore that, because there are people like Rajiv Malhotra who wrote a book. He's a commentator, etc., and he said, quote, agenda-driven political activism posing as academic research, red-washed by corporate money, unquote, is what's really driving this. There's a sort of and that coupled with sort of a woke takeover of our institutions, especially the ones, and some people have gone on like him to go to Ashoka University and others internationally like Harvard and UPenn, etc., etc. You get a lot of stuff coming out from them.
Look, he's not wrong. Malhotra is a very smart guy, and I recommend his book, Snakes in the Ganga. But the fact is that if you're an Indian industrialist and you simply want to support the best social science research on India, what do? You go to the top professors in India. You go to the top Indian origin professors at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, and you ask them, Who should we be supporting? Where should we put our money? You don't know. You're an industrialist. You're a business person. They are supporting the most prestigious intellectuals, the most prestigious Indian origin intellectuals in the world, but they're not responsible for what those intellectuals are writing. The intellectuals would write it either way. The signal boost comes from the Indian industrialists and others. Some of the money comes from the Gulf, so part of the money comes from India itself. There's a strange bedfellows aspect to this. A big part of the money comes from Middle Eastern funders who fund organizations, typically South Asian studies departments, that intentionally use the term South Asian studies instead of Indic studies in order to diminish the role of India in South Asian studies. And some of the money comes literally from missionary foundations. But ultimately, overwhelmingly, it goes to Indian and Indian origin scholars who are simply reflecting what they themselves believe.
And is this driven by prejudice? Because I remember before the last election, 2018, in an interview to me, in fact, the Prime Minister had used the word Khan market consensus. He says, this is what they all belong to. And they have an agenda against me personally. Look, and that gets sort of amplified.
But it's no different than in other countries. Imagine in the United States how many social scientists support Donald Trump. You can probably count them on one hand. Right? It's not
but Modi's not Trump.
It's not a phenomenon that's unique to India. What is unique to India is the extreme politicization of this. I myself have only had one serious cancel attempt. I appreciate the plug for my recent cancellation at Quadrant, but the big attempt was the South Asian Studies Activist Collective in the United States, a group of relatively eminent South Asian Studies scholars, wrote to the University of Sydney asking that I be fired because my research and speaking endangered their lives and the lives of Indian intellectuals, and thus I should be relieved of my position. Now, luckily, we have strong protections for academic freedom in Australia. Nothing came of it. But in a more politicized U.S. university, it might have been a serious problem.
Is this really what happened? That there was an attempt that was made to... I mean, are these people, do they call themselves liberals by any chance?
I was accused of endangering the lives. But this is the same kind of rhetoric we've become used to in what some of us like to call the Great Awakening in Anglo-American society, a quasi-religious awakening, attachment to causes. So it's the same sort of thing that happens if you do research on transsexuality. If you're a feminist who opposes transsexual access to women's bathrooms, you'll be accused of attempted murder of transsexuals. Well, that same rhetoric has now carried over into the India studies world.
Well, let me ask you, and I'm quoting back to you, just as Western anti-Semites are offended by the success of Israel, Western anti-Hinduists are offended by the success of India. They don't fear it, they resent it, unquote. Can you explain this?
Yeah, so that's something I wrote in an article about Western anti-Hinduism and the rise of anti-Hinduism on a parallel with anti-Semitism. You may not be aware of this, but against Israel for the last 25 or 30 years, there's been a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. On campuses all around America and sometimes off campus, BDS has been a campaign to prevent any Israeli scholars from speaking at U.S. universities or Australian universities. Well, now BDS has been applied to India. The Middle East Forum in the U.S. in Washington has been writing about this for about 5 years now, about BDS being applied to India. And it's the same people using the same strategies to try to marginalize India on the global stage. Anti-Hinduism is the new anti-Semitism.
Wow, that's a big insight. Okay, well, we're running out of time, but my final question, how do you see the Indian state evolving from here on? We're talking about Bharatiyata, Bharat, and this is being propelled really by the Prime Minister's own pivoting of this country's cultural, constitutional, and social narrative towards a Hindu civilizational past.
There's a clear Bharat awakening in India. Ironically, I don't think it has much to do with Mr. Modi or the BJP. This is a social movement in India. It's something that would happen even if Mr. Modi were not in power, and will continue even if Mr. Modi loses the 2024 election. The The Bharat Awakening is India coming to terms with its own history. And that's something that India has to do. As an outsider, I take no position on it. It's not my awakening, it's your awakening. Is it accurately reflecting history? Well, that's something for you to decide. But it certainly reflects people's feelings about their history, and it's something that has to be reckoned with.
Thank you, Professor Babones. It's been wonderful speaking to you, and you've been very frank and forthright with your opinion and quite incisive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.